Good afternoon. I am Mila Kostic. I'm Director of Continuing Medical Education at the Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania, and delighted to welcome you all to today's session of the SACME Virtual Journal Club in front of the SACME Program Committee, as well as the Journal Club Editorial Board. I'm thrilled to introduce this first session in a two-part series where we will be examining the effectiveness of continuing medical education, looking at it from different lenses. Delighted that we were so lucky to be able to introduce Dr. Robert Englander, who's the Senior Director of Competency-Based Learning and Assessment Experience at the AAMC, who is going to lead the discussion titled Determining a Quality CME CPD Program, looking at the learnings we could get from the Asch study, the famous study. An opportunity to properly introduce Bob and to facilitate, as usually, our session today is our colleague, Dr. Curtis Olson, best known to us as an editor-in-chief of our journal for continuing education in the health profession. So, Kurt, please take it away.
Thank you, Mila. Before I introduce Dr. Englander, just a few things about procedures on the call. Recall that to ask a question, please use the chat feature. You can ask chat questions at any time. I'll be monitoring them as they come in. Of course, you can also ask questions when you have the opportunity to speak. To make a comment, raise your hand. So there's should be a button that you see on your control panel to do that. And again, I will watch and see who has hand raised, and then I'll call on you when the time comes. Encourage participant discussion as well as discussion with presenter. So don't hesitate to pose a question to a colleague on the phone. Just make clear who you're talking to. And finally, remember that the primary goal here is not to critique the article, but rather to engage in a discussion around the relevance of the article to research and practice in the field. So Dr. Englander, as Mila said, is with AAMC right now. He's also a pediatrician. He's been involved in medical education for many years, mostly at the UME and GME level. The study that he's chosen is about residency programs, but as we talked with Dr. Englander about this study, it became very obvious why he was interested in focusing on it. It raises a number of very interesting and important questions about quality of CME and CPD programs, and so very much looking forward to this session. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Englander with us today, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Bob.
Great. Thanks so much, Mila and Kurt, both for inviting me to do this. This is sort of fun for me, a little bit out of my my normal sort of realm of business. So I'm excited to be joining you all today, and really chose the title, which by the way changed from your original outline, because chose it meaningfully to really get us to think about CME CPD programs, and that's where I hope we'll go today. So I really just have two objectives for us today. The first is to extend our thinking about how we evaluate educational programs through the Asch study example, and then to really think about what are the implications of that Asch study to sort of the world of continuing professional development, continuing medical education, and maintenance of certification. So the article was published in JAMA in 2009, and the article is about evaluating obstetrical residency programs using patient outcomes. And I think is, to me, a seminal article in understanding educational programs. And that's why we really chose it today. So before we really get started, I just wanted to ask the group for your own input. For those of you who have either provided guidance to or worked with students and or residents, what are the assumptions that you've made about the quality of a residency program? So in specific, what is it that makes you recommend a residency training program to a student? So I'd like to open it up to discussion, and for those of you out there to tell us, as you've, in your life, counseled students who are looking at residency programs, what have you told them to look for or to ask about, or how have you decided which programs you think they should go to?
If you want to weigh in on that question, just raise your hand and I will call on you. Jack Dolcourt, unmuting your mic. Jack, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. I think that for me, it's knowing somebody who has come from a training program and admiring their depth of knowledge, their thought, and concluding from that they must have acquired these skills from their residency training program. And when I say a person, I mean like a colleague that I work with that has come from another institution. Oh, that I am done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jack, for that. Call on John Parbison. Oh, I hit the wrong one. Make that Stuart Gilman first, then John.
Oh, hi, thanks. And shout out to Jack Dolcourt. Nice to hear you. I think that, you know, I look at what residents go on to do from those programs and whether that aligns with the trainees' goals. Also the kind of quality of the mentorship and a sense of the culture of the program and whether that's a supportive environment or not. But I also wanted to suggest maybe it would be a different question for us to address is what would be the criteria we'd recommend for a patient to go get treated at an academic program, and would that be a different question than the one about what the trainees would value?
I think that's an awesome question and one that I'd like everybody to keep in mind as we go through this presentation.
John Parbison?
I think Stuart's kind of stole mine a little bit. I was going to say that it's the quality of mentorship in the teachers. To what extent are the teachers perceived as mentors?
Mm-hmm. Very good. At this point, we have no other hands up.
Great. So I appreciate all those comments. What I would say, and I would add a couple things to them. I actually am often in the position of counseling residents, and I will tell you that prior to reading this article, I also counseled them using all of the same things that you all have recommended. I probably would add to that sort of general reputation, what I thought reputationally of the institution overall. In pediatrics, I'm a pediatrician by training, so I might have also counseled them around sort of some of the differences of children's versus non-children's hospitals, for sure. And then a lot of it was based on relationships that I had with resident program directors, associate program directors, prior residents, chief residents from those various programs. So those were really the assumptions that most of us operated on to really be able to talk about the quality of a residency program. But nobody had tested those assumptions until David Asch and his colleagues sort of set out to do so. So they chose obstetrics, and the reason for that was really convenience and data ability. So first of all, there are greater than 4 million births per year in the U.S. Most of the women who deliver are actually pretty healthy, so that allowed them to do limited risk adjustments by program. They were able to attribute the outcomes to a single physician for either vaginal or C-section birth, and that's a really big one. I think, you know, I am an intensivist by training, now a hospitalist, and can tell you that I do very little that I am the sole contributor or even the only or major contributor to the outcome for the patients. So I think that was a big one for why OB really lends itself to this kind of thought. The complications are frequent enough that you can discern differences in rates, although even with fairly low rates of complications with greater than 4 million births a year, my suspicion is they would have been able to show some difference. And then the other thing is there are great databases that were available to link individual obstetricians with a residency program, with deliveries, and with outcomes. So they had great data to go into. So what their methods were they looked at Florida and New York discharge data from 1992 to 2007. And the reason they chose those two is because it had all the qualities of the data that they needed, as outlined on the prior page, and as I'll outline a little further in terms of what they were looking at. So it was looking at all deliveries at non-federal acute care hospitals in those two states between those 16 years, because they were inclusive of 1992 to 2007. And then they used the ICD-9 classifications for vaginal and C-section births because they did separate those two births. So they started with, in that database, 7,130,000 plus births. And then they excluded all the deliveries in which there was critical identifying information for a physician that was incomplete, because they really wanted to be able, clearly as we said, to link the physician both to the delivery and to the outcome for the mother and to the residency program. That resulted in about 6 million, and then they excluded deliveries of physicians from residency programs that had less than 10 residents over the study period. And again, because they really wanted to build this database around residency programs, the problem with less than 10 is that you end up with large standard deviations for those. That resulted in the final data set, which was nearly 5 million deliveries, that incorporated 4,124 obstetricians from 107 residency programs, representing 43% of all of the OB programs, 22 states, and the District of Columbia. Remember, the deliveries were in 2 states, but this just means that the residents, the obstetricians who were practicing in those states came from 22 states and the District of Columbia. The primary outcome that they looked for, the first and foremost, was there or was there not a complication, period. And that they looked at rate for all deliveries overall, vaginal delivery specifically, and C-section delivery. So sort of 3 outcomes there. Any complication for all deliveries, for vaginal deliveries, and for C-section deliveries. And then they looked at the specific, 3 specific complications for each. So for vaginal deliveries, they looked at laceration, hemorrhage, and all other, major ones being infectious and thrombotic. And for C-sections, hemorrhage and infection and all others. And in those cases, the most common that they saw were operative complications and thrombotic complications as well. So basically 9 total outcomes, the 3 for vaginal deliveries, the 3 for C-sections, the overall, and then the overall for vaginal and for C-sections. And what they reported them as is risk standardized complication rates. So they took a risk-adjusted, program-specific complication rate. Remember, now what they're going to do is link all of the OBs to their residency program, because that's what they're trying to get, and get a risk-adjusted, program-specific complication rate. And they divided that by the average risk-adjusted complication rate for all programs, all OBs, to get this risk-standardized complication rate. And that was really the primary outcome. And one of the things that's wonderful about this is that with almost 5 million deliveries, they were able to control for a lot of variables in the model. So they were able to control for the patient variables that you see there, demographics, which year of hospital discharge, whether the patient had Medicaid or no insurance. Those patients obviously have a different risk structure. What the comorbidities were, those patients have a different risk structure. Then physician variables, whether it was Florida versus New York, what the gender of the physician was, and what the years of experience were for that physician, because remember, it was over a 16-year period. They then also controlled for the residency program variables, mostly meaning the NBME and USMLE test scores. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I think it's one of the limitations of the study, but it's still a pretty good marker for proxy for at least reputation of a residency program. So one of the things they tend to boast or demonstrate is their average MBME USMLE scores for each of their residents, or for their residents in the aggregate. And then for the hospital variables, they look to see, did that hospital have an OB residency program or rotations in OB, yes or no. So it was just a yes or no variable. So all of those variables that I just mentioned, the patient variables, the resident variables, the hospital variables, and the residency program variables, all were placed into a model to get to that risk standardized complication rate. So the bottom line result was that residency programs could be ranked by the quality of outcomes of their graduates into 5 quintiles. There was a strong and significant increased risk of complications for the bottom versus the top quintile. So the total risk of complication in the top quintile was 10.3%, and in the bottom quintile was 13.6%. And these are pretty significant complications. So a 3.3% difference is pretty significant, because most of those OBs are doing 100 deliveries a year. So that means at least 3 or more patients for everyone in that bottom, on average, had a complication compared to everybody in the top. There were no significant differences, and this was an interesting finding, when adjusted for board scores of the residents. So the board scores were not at all predictive of the quality of their OB outcomes. And the other piece was there was remarkable consistency of rankings across the complications and the type of delivery. So in other words, if you were a bottom quintile hospital or residency training program for one of those 9 variables, the odds were you were either in the bottom quintile or the 4th quintile for all of the other 8 markers. Same thing if you were in the top quintile, you tended to be in the bottom, in the top for all of the other 8 markers. So in fact, something like, I'm not sure exactly from the paper, but it's around 80% for 80% of the complications, you were either in one of 2 directly linking quintiles. So the 1st and 2nd, the 2nd and 3rd, 3rd and 4th, etc. So really pretty impressive consistency across complications. So basically the conclusions of the authors are these programs differ significantly in the quality of care provided by their graduates, and it's up to 15 years after graduation. It says a lot to me about imprinting. The second conclusion is that the rankings are generally consistent across those delivery modalities and complications. So it really is sort of you almost get a feeling that there is a quality outcome that sort of permeates the entire program and probably is not procedure specific, for example. And that the difference between a top tier and a bottom tier hospital is, in my mind, relatively large, because you're talking about a 3.3% difference, which is a 30% difference in complication rates of significant complications for OBGYN. The authors do talk about some limitations. They studied only New York and Florida, so therefore they studied only about 43% of the residency programs. There's clearly some database restrictions. They limited the outcomes to maternal only because the birth outcomes were not easy to follow through the databases. And then there's always a possibility that they've limited important variables that may vary across residency programs. I think they put this in there as a limitation. I think it's pretty minor when you look at all the variables that they controlled for in their model. The next thing is that the sample assumes an average of a program's performance over the 16-year study period. And that's a big one to me, because that assumes that, it was the same, the programs that were in the bottom quintile in '92 would have also been in the bottom quintile in 2007. And while that may be true, my suspicion is that there are probably some percentage of programs that changed in their overall quality of their outcomes over the course of that study period. So here are the questions that I think we should spend the rest of our time talking about. The first, they all sort of go together, but in my mind, what are our assumptions? So we talked about our assumptions that we make when we recommend residency training programs to medical students. So what are the assumptions that we make when we either create or encourage physicians to choose or recommend to physicians CME programs? And how might the findings of what we just discussed about in the Asch et al. Challenge how we think about CME and CPD? And then finally, what are the outcomes that we should be looking for? And are we evaluating an activity or a program, and does it matter? So I'm going to stop there, but I think maybe what we'll do before we get to the questions is just briefly ask if there are questions specifically about the Asch article.
Okay, watching for hands to come up. You can also type in a question on chat if you'd like me to relay it to Dr. Englander. John Parbising. Yes, John.
I think I noticed in the article that physicians were eliminated because of incomplete data, and the closer you got to 2009 was the article, I think, or the end, the more recent, is that, so in other words, there was a bias towards more recent graduates because of the incomplete data of the previous ones. And secondly, I think they also noticed that there were more female residents in that group. And also related to that is the rate of change of information and the half-life of information as we approach more recent times. Any comments about that?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, first of all, I think they're all good points. I think that the if you look, the average, if I may get this wrong, but the average of everybody who they looked at through this database was about 18 years of experience, and I think that was true of both the C-section and the I don't remember the exact number, but it was around 18 years experience. So the bottom line to me is that they had a really good range, but you are correct that there was probably a little bit of bias towards more recent graduates just because the databases had gotten better in the second half of the study. So I don't know if that would change significantly the primary premise. I think the other variables that you talk about that could work, in my mind, would work towards more towards confirming the null hypothesis. So that the fact that they had significant findings even with those issues suggests to me that it may have even been more significant if they had taken them into account. So I don't know, and we'll never know, but I think it's hard to argue in my mind the findings of this study given the numbers and given the accuracy of the data that they did have. And I do think it was better probably to eliminate those physicians for whom they either didn't have clear residency program data and or clear direct outcome data for the deliveries.
Any other questions about the article itself? Seeing none.
Waiting for that, I just wanted to mention that I had an opportunity to let David Asch know that we are using his study in this journal club and invite him to join us. And he thought about it and then declined because he really did not wish to influence the discussion and the potential critique of the study, which I thought was nice and interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm still seeing no more additional questions about the article.
Great. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Kurt, and if you could help facilitate maybe the discussion now around the questions, and maybe add your own.
Sure, sure. Well, let's start with that question about how we think about quality in CME or CPD programs, and I'm using that term advisedly. The distinction Bob makes in his last question is program versus activity. So at the program level, we're really talking about the portfolio of a CME provider in toto. So, I mean, as you think about, where are the good programs, what leads you to consider them good? Dr. Stuart Gilman.
Thanks. You know, I guess the thing that is occurring to me as I look at this is the suggestion that CME or CPD did not serve to equalize, right? If we assume that there were quality differences in the outcomes of the trainees at the time they finished their residency, even going through 10 to 15 years of continuous professional development failed to address shortcomings some of the poorer performers in those studied cohorts have. And to me, that's a troubling implication, right? Because we would like to think that our enterprise helps people do better who aren't doing well enough for some of our participants.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and also one that sort of jumped out at me as one of the first thoughts that I had about this. You know, we have a lot of evidence that shows that CME has an effect, at least in its various forms. Some forms more effective than others. We're beginning to see evidence that it influences clinical practice. So whether that be diabetes management or smoking cessation counseling or any number of things. You know, it's a very interesting conundrum. How do we make sense out of these two seemingly contradictory views? Jack Dolcourt.
Thanks, Kurt. I had to pause quite a while to think about Dr. Englander's question. How do you decide what's a good CME program or what isn't? And I sort of found myself speechless for a moment because I really don't know how. I think that the ideas of what I consider a good CME program, and I'm thinking about the portfolio, would be an institution that has creativity and has a wide range of activities that it provides. But as I'm gathering from this Asch article, that probably is not what we ought to be talking about. The kind of things that CME activities address, CME program, the portfolio of things that CME programs address is oftentimes what's new and breaking, and it has nothing to do with procedural sort of things, and it has nothing to do with a feedback from what is actually happening out in the trenches. And I think this raises the importance of trying to come up with some sort of personalized CME, because even though we looked at only certain characteristics, hemorrhage, laceration, that certain practitioners may have educational needs for one area, others have different sort of educational needs, though I did get the message that difficulties are not confined to just one particular complication, that certain individuals are prone to having multiple complications, clusters of things that go wrong. So anyway, those are my thoughts and conundrums, and I found this a very, very stimulating article.
Mm-hmm. Stuart Gilman has a reaction to the question I posed earlier in terms of what the CME research shows. And Stuart?
Oh, well, thanks. I was just going to suggest that we're comparing apples and oranges in a way. I think most of what we would call CME research or even program evaluation is really looking pretty narrowly at did our programs do and the individuals who came through our programs accomplish the expected results. But this study is looking, it's really approaching this much more from a population-based sample, where they're making no assumption of what of these physicians did any CPD, or where they did it, or how they did it. And of course, the study's not even about CPD. We're inferring that the failure for change is a CPD issue. And so I'm actually just sitting here not able to easily think about a comparable study design and sample design that lets us really address that same question. I don't think that the question that we're challenged with by this study is the one most CME research answers.
Kurt, can I just, I think that's a really interesting comment. First of all the comments I think have been great and spot on. And for me, it makes me think, are we asking the right questions? So it is concerning to me that in some respects, a person's quality performance could have been predicted by their residency program many years out. Suggests to me that that is the sentinel event in many ways, and that we haven't learned how to do much to influence that outside of it. But the reason is, I think, partly because of what our last speaker just said, which was that what we're measuring is sort of specific issues or outcomes or of objectives of individual learning activities. And so one of the things that I really would be interested in is, has anybody thought about CPD or CME as a program? So I think there are places that are beginning to think that way, particularly as they try to help faculty in the maintenance of certification. So it's thinking more about a program that is designed to really move individual faculty over time, as opposed to an activity. And I think that's an interesting, that activity program paradox, I think, is an interesting one to look at from this article's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there were a number of good points in that comment. I just want to echo that, and also, I was thinking about who's the target of the research here. So an outcome study looks at oftentimes the people who have participated in an activity versus those who did not. But even those who did not is usually selected from some larger subset of the entire population of that particular group of physicians, whereas this study is casting a very wide net without regard to patterns of participation in CME. And so I guess something comparable, and this is not so much from the program level, but from the activity level, would be to see if, say, a series of activities on a particular topic had any effect on the population of physicians as a whole. And I can see all kinds of problems with attempting to do a study like that. But in terms of that, trying to understand what would a comparable study look like in our universe. Nancy Davis, I see you have your hand up.
Yep. Hi, thanks, Kurt. Hi, Bob. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. And Bob introduced me to this article a couple of years ago when I was working on something at IMC. And the thing that really excited me about it was the opportunity to teach continuous quality improvement in residency, because I think what this study showed us is that if we can introduce that concept during residency, that we really will help these folks as they go into their careers to really continue to improve. Bob mentioned maintenance of certification. I think that's one small piece of it. But the opportunity, I think, to introduce quality improvement during residency and make that a part of their practice life is really important. And where we come in CPD is primarily in the faculty development, because as we all know, the faculty aren't really prepared. They haven't had this opportunity during their residency training. So to me, that was a really important message from this article.
Thanks, Nance. I just, one of the things that I thought about that's interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, I should ask David Asch, is whether he fed back the results to the individual physicians. My guess is he didn't, because I'm pretty sure they were probably de-identified, but how many of these OBs even knew their complication rates and knew and would have known how those complication rates related to their peers?
I have two thoughts. So say we were to look at, first of all, when I read this the first time, obviously the first impression is, well, can CME actually do anything? This negates us in a way. But then you could think about it differently. Does it, and could it be, you know, could they have studied the Grand Rounds program at these institutions where the residency programs were so impactful, the top quintile? So, you know, is there something there that we could tie CME with those good results, potentially? We could think of that. And then I thought of, well, could we, if we designed a study today to look at effectiveness of CME, say CME activity, and then look at the outcomes the same way they did here, what would that, what would that really, if we did observed behaviors, would that, could we even make that attributable to any kind of meaningful CME, knowing what we know from the Asch study? Do you see what I'm saying? So that would that mean that, well, maybe, but maybe everything that these people did well is still attributable to their training, residency training. So it's a lot of conundrums, but I think that where it is difficult to draw parallels between residency programs and CME programs, CPD programs, is the fact that we de facto don't have a program, because what constitutes a program in residency is the existence of a defined curriculum and set of competencies, and we don't have the CPD.
So let me just throw out, and again, I like to be a little bit of a provocateur, but what if part of maintenance of certification was that every physician needed to actually be accepted by a program of continuous professional development, and that those programs grew and were sponsored in the same way that residency programs are, so that all of us had to have a specific program that we went to. How, if that were you and you were trying to attract physicians to that program, what would it look like? How would you do it? What would you do differently based on this type of article and what we understand from it?
That's a very interesting notion. So the term continuing education home or academic home came to mind, sort of that notion. I see John Parbasing has his hand up. Don't know if it's to comment on this question or something else, but go ahead, John.
No, thank you. When we talk about a program of continuing education or practice improvement, my bias leads me right to either communities of practice or learning collectives. And I think that I'm trying to bring to mind a publication in Britain in the 90s that really said the quality of your professional development and your practice is dependent on the company you keep. And I think that that is something that could be nurtured and changed if we had well-structured programs of continued professional development which involve network learning. I'll leave it at that.
I think that's brilliant, and I just want to say I love that idea, and how exciting would it be to see somebody formulate a program in continuing professional development that was centered not on a series of talks, but on the development of a learning community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard a couple of hypotheses here that might explain, at least in part, these results. One was in what John had to say, which is that, is it the case that these residents who leave the programs from the top quintile versus the top end up being, to some degree, a learning community? They have some degrees of a common history. Is there anything to that? Is there something that is engendered by the programs that they go through that encourages that builds those relationships, those relationships maintained over time? The other thing, going back to Mila's comment, was, is it the case that the graduates of the top quintile programs also come from programs where CME is highly valued and is thoughtfully designed and delivered and is useful to them in their practice, and so is part of the impact here, that program, a learning orientation that they carry forward. So, just some different ways of thinking about factors that might contribute to the kind of results that Asch shows. Well, I think, Bob, you called our attention to an article that recently appeared in Academic Medicine. It was in the February issue, so the most recent one. This is a study by France Lagarre at the University of Laval in Quebec, and a large group of her colleagues. The title of this is "The Majority of Accredited Continuing Professional Development Activities Do Not Target Clinical Behavior Change." So what they did was took a look at activities, the learning objectives, that is CPD activities offered by medical schools and other providers in Quebec. They analyzed those objectives. They had 110 in their pool over a 10-month period, or sorry, about a 5-month period. And what they found was that most accredited CPD activities were generally not designed to promote clinical behavior change because the focus was on remembering and understanding information instead of preparing physicians to put this knowledge into practice. So I think this raises some interesting questions about the extent to which what we're doing can and should be oriented around change in clinical practice, if that is indeed what we hope to promote.
I put the abstract up. I hope everybody can see on the screen.
It is also attached on the journal, Virtual Journal Club page on SACME website for this session. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, you can after this. But it's interesting because we can talk about whether looking at Bloom's taxonomy and using learning objectives in a way where we assessing, the span of the cognitive depth of the aims of our intervention is really how we measure the effectiveness. And the article has really interesting discussions towards new models where they discuss the theory of planned behavior and get more into the sociocognitive science of behavioral change.
Mm-hmm. let's see. Have a few comments here from participants. Luis Salazar says our entire program is RSS and PI projects. Let's see. Also, I have a comprehensive curriculum approach that we've been doing here at KP, using RSS instead of simply offering one-off activities. We plan series to address gaps over time and so on. And so, you know, what Luis is referring to, I hear it sounds very much like truly a program of continuing education activities, and that is a group of activities that are purposely designed and aligned around certain priorities. And so it's a program of action, if you will, that is coordinated to some degree, integrated to some degree, and aimed at improving practice. So sounds like good work.
Yeah, I was wondering if you would be willing to share with us what some of the outcome measures are that you're looking at for that program.
So, Luis, are you willing to share that with us? Sorry, I now have you unmuted. No comments there. I guess a question that I would like to pose, going back to the Lagare article, is it necessary and desirable that every accredited CPD activity have as its primary aim choosing clinical practice, and that be the main criterion by which the effectiveness of that activity is gauged? So in other words, if it ain't producing practice change, whether it be a PI activity or a grand rounds, then we should question whether or not that's a valuable activity. So should we expect everything that's in our portfolios, our program portfolios, to be contributing directly to the practice change? Let's see, Stuart Gilman, go ahead.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is we should, but we also have to be very explicit about how we're defining what's clinical practice, and that clinical practice involves a great deal more than direct patient interaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a very good point. What also comes to mind for me was a large nationwide project that I was involved in a few years back when I was at Wisconsin, having to do with tobacco cessation. And there were different layers of that in terms of the educational intervention. Part of this was all stimulated by the publication of the new tobacco cessation guidelines, which are about as evidence-based as you can get in terms of medical practice. And so the aim was to raise the visibility of these guidelines, make sure people understood how it was different compared to the previous guidelines, and conferences, presentations, very didactic kinds of sessions were used to deliver that. They were also used to recruit some subset of participants into more elaborate types of interventions, for example, PI project, or clinical quality improvement support at that level. And so there was no expectation so that the information dissemination part of this was going to contribute directly to change, but rather set the conditions for change, recognizing that people would be at different degrees of readiness to change and drawing into the mix those who are ready to take action. So that would be an example of two activities where one of them is not aimed at changing practice directly and in the short term, but nevertheless is part of a program of action where things are linked together and there's a logic behind it. So enough said about that. Other comments, questions, observations at this point? Going to give this a few minutes here to let people think about that.
This is Stuart. I actually, it's kind of a sideways thing, but related to other to work of yours, Dr. Englander. Do you see, or what relationship do you see?
I just lost the comment at what relationship do I see?
We seem to have lost your connection. Oh no, we lost Kurt.
Yeah, it looks like Kurt's.
Who did we lost Kurt?
His phone connection.
Lost Kurt.
So at the same time we lost Kurt, I also lost the comment.
Yeah, weird.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I got back on there. I got muted maybe when Kurt dropped. So the question was, what's the relationship between competency and these other issues we've been talking about stimulated from this paper?
Yeah, well, I think in my mind, competency is an organizing framework for education across the continuum. So the concept is that we've kind of come to this agreement that there are essentially what we call 8 domains of competence. For the CPD world, you've used 6, the same as the ACGME. So let's call 6 domains of competence. And within those, there are competencies that physicians have to sort of continually strive towards mastery in throughout their lives. And I think lots of those competencies relate to where one performed versus top quintile versus bottom quintile. And the big question in my mind is, what are the critical ones that we should be addressing in the continuous professional development world in order to optimize? You know, what I'd like is to see people graduate from residency and those who are in the bottom quintile still make it to the top quintile of performance. So I think, you know, Nancy gave us a starting point for that, which is probably that we've got to at least get people to competent on, or hopefully proficient on, the competencies in the domain of practice-based learning and improvement. That if they don't at least even know how to ask questions about their practice, study their practice, and then make improvements based on what they learn, it's going to be a struggle to imagine how anybody will perform in a very different way than they did when they were sort of really under that wing of the residency program. So I think, in my mind, it's, you know, it absolutely fits the sort of framework of competencies. The competencies that CPD in particular should focus on, I think, really do go to the patient care and practice-based learning improvement competencies predominantly.
So could you envision, Bob, maybe the critical 13 just like you had undergraduates to pass into the residency program, something similar come out of that next turnover from residency to practicing physician.
Yeah, well, it actually exists. Those are called entrustable professional activities, and those are just a framework for assessing competence. But they exist for several specialties now. Internal medicine just published some. Pediatrics has done it. OBGYN in the Netherlands, psychiatry in Australia and New Zealand have published these, and those are really specialty specific once you get to the residency level. The interesting thing, and I've had this we started this discussion actually at the annual meeting with David Price talking to us about what would the implications be if EPAs were the organizing framework in CPD. In other words, if instead of saying, take a test, figure out what your deficiencies are, we could say these are the 15 or 20 activities that you've got to be able to do throughout your career, and how are we going to note that you are in an ongoing way competent to do them and trustworthy to do them and trustable to do them. So, but to me, it gets to the same issues as the Asch article. Basically, it's moving beyond one-offs to programs that are clearly designed for behavior change or improvement in care.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think, I'm sorry, Kirk, you would think that what would cut across specialties would be things like communication and professionalism and ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are, it's interesting that there are 3 or 4 entrustable professional activities that have come up in every single specialty so far. So things like handover communication has come up in all of them. The ability to participate in or lead an interprofessional team has come up in all of those kinds of things.
So I want to relay, we had asked Luis Salazar earlier about what kinds of outcomes they might be tracking in terms of their program. He wrote a reply back. One of our areas of focus is interaction between specialties, timeliness of care, appropriate workup and referrals, utilization data, communication between clinical team members, documentation for seamless interaction. So a lot of emphasis there on the communication, coordination, teamwork, and so on as major outcomes that are clearly tied to quality of care.
So that's fantastic, and I would be willing to wager, based on Mila's message earlier, that if we were to study the physicians from that organization over the next 15 years, we would find them in one of the top quintiles.
Indeed. So, well, that sounds like a good place to bring this conversation to a close. I want to thank you, Dr. Englander. This has been a very interesting and provocative session. I had not been aware of the Asch article prior to your bringing it up. I'm very glad to now be familiar with it. It's has a lot to say, raises a lot of good questions. So thank you very much. And I will, unless any of the organizers have anything they want to contribute, give you a chance to do that.
So, first, this is Mila. I just want to, again, thank you and thank Dr. Englander for a terrific session, and remind everybody that we do have another session scheduled next month, and that's March 6th, Friday, the same time as this, 3:30 Eastern Time. And we will have Dr. Don Moore discuss the latest Cervero's study on effectiveness of CME. So we'll be looking at a different perspective, looking at the same problem. And I hope that you can join us. Reminding you also that we do record our sessions, so if you've missed part of this one or earlier ones, they are posted under archived sessions. That's a link from the website menu of the Journal Club menu. and to remind you that we look forward to your participation and evaluation when it comes your way, because we're trying to see what works, what doesn't, what excites you, what you'd like to hear more about, or suggest an article or presenter or yourself volunteer to do something. And I do thank you all for participating today.
Yes, and with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.